So check this out. My first encounter. The year was 1999. I had just given birth and had been home from the hospital for a few days. My family and I were in bed when my baby started crying. My husband got up to heat a bottle and then returned to bed, falling asleep again. At that moment, I saw my ex-fiancé, who had passed away 2 years earlier. He was screaming at me to get up, his words threatening that he would never speak to me again if I didn't wake up. They brought me to full alertness. I leapt up and began screaming for my husband to wake up too. The house was filled with smoke. The pan had melted onto the stove, and the bottle was completely melted as well. I grabbed the baby, I rushed out of the house and into the car. My husband opened all the windows in the house. We then headed straight to the ER, where both of us needed breathing treatments. Fortunately, the baby was perfectly fine. It was a terrifying experience and one that I've never shared with anyone, except for my husband when he asked me why I had woken up. Blast to the past. In 2019, me and my now husband were enjoying a cold beer in our rented flat one night. We were daydreaming of the future and scrolling through Rightmove, looking at properties out of our price range, wondering what it would be like to live in and own one of these homes. This is something we often did, sending each other properties that both of us knew we wouldn't be able to afford. I would often make a comment of, "That's it, that's the one." And my husband would respond with, yes, for that price I'll take 2. Well, this night was like no other. We scoured the web for properties all across the UK, with no intention of actually perusing this dream due to our current financial circumstances. "You're gonna love this one," my husband said. "It's right up your alley. Cozy cottage, rural, log burner." "Say no more, send it to me," I said. The moment I heard the words cozy cottage, I was already in love. Ping. He sent across the link and I excitedly started scrolling through the listing. "Oh my god, that's the one," I said, but this time it was different. It really was the one. My heart started racing as I read deeper into the property specifics, and it was everything I've ever dreamed of. And my husband, he knew it too. Just one slight problem. The price. No way would we be able to afford this house, and even if we could save the money, the property would definitely sell before then. "We have to go see it, Leo." "We can't, darling. We can't afford to buy right now. And besides, it's 2 hours away. Would you even want to move that far?" I said of course I would. For that house, I would move to the other side of the country. It's perfect. I was hooked, and I knew that I needed to at least view this property. A feeling that I've never had before. We had never considered actually viewing any of the previous properties that we had, quote, fallen in love with before. "Sorry, love. One day we will have our dream home," Leo said, but I knew that I had to have this house. Well, the next morning, I got up for work and noticed my husband was already in his home office. "Early start?" I asked as I walked into his office, and I noticed the house listing open on his computer screen. "I can't stop thinking about that house," he said. "I'm going to call the estate agents today and maybe book a viewing, but don't get your hopes up. I just don't see how we can afford it. But there's no harm in looking, right?" I was like a kid in a toy shop. I was so excited to actually view a property, and the fact that it was my dream home, my hopes couldn't be any higher. Leo spoke with the estate agents and booked a viewing for the following Saturday. 5 days I had to wait to view the house. Every day I was certain that we would get a call saying the house had been sold or that they weren't taking any more viewings, but Saturday came around and it was finally time to make the 2-hour journey. The car ride felt like a lifetime. We spoke about our future, the house, and finances. We both knew we wouldn't be able to afford to do this, but we jumped in with rose-tinted glasses anyway. There it is. I pointed at the for sale sign propped up outside the cottage. It looked exactly like the photos. We were greeted at the door by the current owners, and they quickly showed us in. There's not many times in life where I find myself speechless, but this is one of those times. The cottage was surreal, and the location was perfect. I looked at my husband, and his face said it all. He too was in love with the house. The homeowners seemed very nice. They explained that they were in a hurry to sell and were sad to be leaving after only spending 1 year in the property. 1 year? I thought to myself, I would spend the rest of my life here. But little did I know what was to come. Back in the car, me and my husband were silent. We both knew it wouldn't be possible. We told ourselves not to get our hopes up before coming here, but now that we'd seen the house, we both knew that it really was the one. That night, we sat and went through all of our expenses, canceling all of our unnecessary subscriptions, desperately trying to find an inch of possibility to scrape together the deposit that we needed. But no matter how hard we tried, we would fall at least $10,000 short of what we needed. Disheartened and exhausted, we both agreed it wasn't possible and that we would just have to forget that we'd ever seen the house. We emailed the estate agents, thanked them for their time, and asked them to keep us in the loop on the sale of the cottage. The following day was as normal as our Sundays were. We met family, went shopping, and continued as if nothing happened. That was, of course, until Leo had an unexpected business call to take. "Really? You're going to answer that? It's a Sunday. Can't they wait till you're back in?" I asked. "I won't be long. I'm not sure who it is, but it could be urgent." He took himself off to answer the call. Roughly 5 minutes later, he walked back in the room, only it had looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What's wrong?" I shouted, hurrying over to him. "You're never gonna believe it. Someone has just offered me a job on the side. It's a cash in hand sort of thing." "That's great. Do you think you can do it? I know you're quite busy as it is." I asked the question, but I knew he would say yes. Leo's a workaholic. "You don't understand, Chloe. This isn't a small job. They've offered me $10,000 to do this for them." "Are you serious?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like someone above had sent an angel. All I could think of was the house. I accepted it straight away. I need to start working on it tonight, and they need it desperately. I said, "That's fantastic, love. $10,000 is exactly enough for the house deposit." He finished my sentence. We were both slightly weirded out by the coincidence, but we've always lived by the motto, if it's meant to be, it will be. The following morning, we rang the estate agents first thing and placed our offer on the house. By the afternoon, we had been accepted and had already received all the legal documents to fill in. We were over the moon, and for the next 4 months, we worked relentlessly to save any extra pennies, both putting in overtime and my husband working side jobs and evenings and weekends to make sure that we had the best start in our new home. Move-in day came around, and the whole process was so smooth sailing. It was really meant to be, I thought. It took us some time to adjust to our new home, getting our bearings in a new town, coming to terms that we were homeowners, and making sure every last ornament was placed perfectly. We both often joked that the house felt like it was drawing us in, almost like it had a personality. Maybe this was because the property was nearly 200 years old and it had a lot of character. But after a while, I did start to get a slight uneasy feeling. All of the coincidences and the fact that we were actually in the property did make me start to question how this was actually possible. Now, before I continue deeper into this story, I want to pause here to tell you that my husband is the biggest skeptic I've ever met. We couldn't be more opposite when it comes to the paranormal and supernatural. In some ways, this is a good thing because he would rationalize some of the things that I experienced, putting my mind at ease. But on the other hand, I would often find it frustrating when he wouldn't believe the things that I was explaining to him. Back to the story. We had now been living in the cottage for a few months. For the most part, we had settled in nicely. There was just a few things that had started out of the ordinary. Items would randomly disappear and reappear in a completely different place. Keys placed on the side in the kitchen would go missing for days and show up in the bedside cabinet. TV remotes would randomly appear on the kitchen side after we both had sworn that we hadn't moved them. I was starting to get very weirded out by these experiences, but my husband would simply put it down as just us being tired. As frustrating as it is, he was probably right, I thought. We were both working hard during the day and decorating at night, and we were probably just misplacing the items ourselves, right? It was a Friday night. We had both been up late watching a movie, and I think I drank one too many cups of tea. We went to bed, and as expected, I was up in the night needing to use the loo. The route to the bathroom from the master bedroom is as follows. Come out of the door, to the right was the staircase, turn left, the bathroom was immediately in front of you, and to the left again was a long, dark hallway that led to the spare bedroom. The spare bedroom door was always closed due to an open fireplace in there that caused a draft down the hall. As I approached the bathroom door, something told me to look down the hallway towards the spare bedroom. To my surprise, the door to the spare bedroom was open, and to my horror, I could make out a dark figure lurking in the corner. I froze in fear. Petrified and unable to move, all I could do was watch on as right before my eyes, the house transformed back in time to the 1800s. Now there was an iron cot in the corner of the room where we had placed a wardrobe, and the fire was burning even though it was now out of use. I was so confused but still unable to move due to the pure adrenaline rushing through my body. I watched as the figure emerged out of the corner of the room and walked towards the cot. It was a woman dressed in a white Victorian-style dress. She was crying hysterically, leaning over the cot and looking down in what I could only make out to be a deceased child. My heart racing, I managed to take a step closer to the bathroom door. The floorboards underneath me creaked, and in that moment I felt these eyes burning into the side of my head. She saw me. I screamed and ran back into my bedroom and slammed the door shut. What? What is it? My husband jumped out of bed. I saw a woman in the spare room, but it wasn't the spare room, it was different. It was like I was in a different time zone, and You what? He asked, still half asleep. Before I could even answer again, though, he was walking out of the bedroom door. Wait! I shouted as I ran after him. We both walked out into the hallway, and the door to the spare room was closed. There's nothing there. He opened the door and looked around. The room was back to normal. You were probably just sleepwalking or something. It's 3 a.m., Chloe. Let's go back to sleep. I know what I saw, I said as I hurried back into bed. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. I kept thinking about the lady that I saw. Who was she? Why was she crying, and what happened to the baby? Questions I knew I'd probably never get the answers to. The next day, we both went about our day. Whenever I tried to mention the whole ordeal to my husband, he would just put it down to me being tired. Frustrated, I knew this time that this wasn't the case. I knew what I'd seen and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. A whole year had passed since that night and it's now 2020. COVID was on the rise and lockdowns were on the way. The past year had been pretty uneventful in the house. The odd items were still being misplaced and sometimes I would see things out of the corner of my eye, but nothing that couldn't be explained. Things like a breeze moving a curtain or a shadow from car lights shining through the window. One thing is for sure, I hadn't seen that lady again. We were both now working from home, spending 24/7 in the cottage due to COVID, and we were both starting to get cabin fever when restrictions finally started to be lifted for the first time. The first thing we did was book a week away in North Wales. Wales had our heart. The open, endless countryside, the beaches and quaint cottages. We would always visit once or twice a year and always joked that one day we would live there. On our visit this time, though, we walked past an estate agent's in a small village and saw an advertisement for a small cottage, and for the first time it was actually in our price range. "Hey, look at this, love." I pointed through the window at the advertisement. "Yes, it's lovely, but my gosh, that needs some work." He wasn't wrong. It was on the brink of being derelict. No heating, holes in the windows, and it was definitely a fixer-upper. "Fancy a project?" I joked. Before we could continue the conversations, there was an emergency news broadcast flashing up on our phones. The country was to go back into lockdown in the next 24 hours. We had to rush back to the holiday and get packed up for our belongings and head home. Back home, our spirits were pretty low. We were always sad when we had to leave Wales, but this was different. We were both mourning the country and wanted nothing more but to return. A few weeks had passed and, I guess out of curiosity, we began searching Rightmove for houses in North Wales. The derelict cottage was no longer for sale, but that was no surprise to me. It was priced perfectly for a builder or a DIYer to snap it up. We talked at length and decided to put our house up for sale. Maybe it was the lockdowns, maybe it was something else, but our perfect little cottage wasn't so perfect anymore. The inviting feeling that we had once felt had disappeared, and the house always felt cold. We spoke to a few estate agents and promptly decided who we would list the house with. Within a few days, there was now a for sale sign standing outside our home. And now, like I said, the energy had shifted. The house was different, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. The second that for sale sign went up, it was like we had awoken something evil in the house. That same night we listed the house, me and Leo had been celebrating with a cold beer. "Cheers to whatever the future brings," we said. We had a late one and headed off to bed. I remember feeling uneasy, almost as if being watched that night, but I just put it down to maybe having one too many. Tossing and turning, I struggled to sleep. My husband, on the other hand, was flat out snoring next to me. I was just about to nod off when something inside me told me to open my eyes. And there she was. The woman I had seen over a year ago in the spare room was now standing over our bed. The unmistakable outline of her Victorian dress and her mousy blonde hair in an out-of-date updo. She was staring at my husband sleeping. I closed my eyes shut, thinking that when I reopened them, she would disappear. I slowly opened my eyes, but she was still there, only now she had her hand out, slowly approaching my husband, heading straight for his throat. I screamed and watched as she contorted her head towards me, grinning, as she was still leaning towards my husband, hand stretched out, ready to strangle him. I dived under the covers once again, jolting my husband awake. "Are you okay?" he shouted. I was sobbing, inconsolable, and unable to find any words to explain to him what I had just saw and what just happened. "Chloe, what's wrong? You're starting to worry me now." He sat up, giving me a cuddle, and calmed me down before I could talk. "I saw her." "Saw who?" he asked, understandably confused. "I saw the woman, the same woman that I saw in the spare room last year, but this time she was trying to kill you." Usually, he would have some witty excuse as to what I had seen, but this time, I could tell he was dead serious. I was a wreck, and he had never seen me like this before, and maybe somewhere in the back of his mind, he could tell that I was just being truthful. I didn't sleep much for the next week, and Leo could see how the house was draining my energy. We pushed on to find a new property as quickly as possible, and accepted every house viewing for our cottage. It only took 1 week for us to find a buyer for our house, and they put an offer in just above our asking price, and we were ecstatic. We accepted their offer right away. As usual, that night we toasted to selling our house, and we were stood in the kitchen on FaceTime with family sharing the good news. "I just need the loo," I said, running upstairs. Leo was still in the kitchen on FaceTime with his mother. I was washing up in the bathroom when I had the uneasy feeling come over me. Once again, I felt watched. I felt as though someone or something was standing outside the bathroom door, waiting for me to come out. Shaking off the fear, I slowly opened the bathroom door. Standing in the doorway of our master bedroom was the woman, and she was partially blocking my only exit to the top of the staircase. I once again froze as she turned to look at me. Her face twisted and her eyes turned black. She began to hysterically scream in my face, and dark tears ran down her angry expression on her face. She started to move closer to me, and I ran like hell for the stairs, closing my eyes and screaming myself as I ran past her down the stairs and back into the kitchen. "She's here. She's at the top of the stairs," I cried as I ran to Leo. His mom was still on the other end of the phone. It's okay. You're safe now." Leo once again tried to comfort me, but as before, I was too distraught. We slept in the living room that night and went together on toilet shifts. Whatever or whoever she was, I could tell that she was angry at us. Maybe it was because we were selling the house. I don't know. But something in that house had changed. Over the next few months, we were dealing with solicitors and estate agents on a weekly basis. Nothing about this house was smooth sailing, and we still couldn't find a house to move into ourselves. Our spirits started to dampen when we lost our first buyer and had to relist the house for sale. We had decided that if we don't sell again in a fortnight, and if we haven't found a house ourselves, then we would have to take the house off the market. One evening, we were scrolling through the internet for houses, as always, and I spotted the house that had started all of this. The derelict cottage in North Wales had been relisted, but this time for even cheaper than before. I showed my husband and we agreed to book a viewing. The following weekend, we drove the 3.5 hours to Wales to see the property. We had never been to this area before. We knew nothing about it, and for all we know, it could have been cheap just because of the area. Nevertheless, we still went. And upon arrival, we noticed just how rural this house was. There were no neighbors, no main roads, no streetlights. Just this tiny cottage standing amongst the fields and fields of farmland. "Area can't be that bad if there's no one here," Leo joked. What a view, though. I pointed towards the end of the garden, and that view was like something out of a painting. It was in that moment that I knew that it didn't matter what the house looked like on the inside, that view was worth millions to me. We looked around the property and quickly realized it needed a lot more work than we were capable of. But for some crazy reason, we both loved the house. We thanked the estate agent for showing us around and asked if there had been much interest. They said yes, we have 5 more viewings today and lots more over the weekend. We hurried into the car and knew if we wanted it that we would have to move fast. I don't know what it is about that house, but I feel safe in there, I said to Leo as I was buckling my seatbelt up. Yeah, I know what you mean. What do you think about all the work it needs, though? He asked. It's a lot of work, but man, that view is amazing. It's definitely worth it just for that. We drove 1 mile up the road, pulled over, and rang the estate agents immediately. Unbeknownst to me, my husband decided to put in a lowball offer, explaining to the estate agents that the property needs a lot of TLC and it wouldn't be possible at the price listed. I thought he was crazy as the sellers had already listed the property at $40,000 less than they had the first time around. We waited eagerly for a call back from the estate agent, worried that the sellers would be offended by our offer and wouldn't want to negotiate with us. To my surprise, though, they accepted. Not only did they accept our offer, but they canceled all the viewings that were booked to take place for that afternoon, too. We raced home so excitedly, but also a little shocked at what we had just done. We weren't DIY professionals, and this was a big move, even further away from our friends and families. Upon arriving home, we received a phone call from our estate agents. We received an offer on our house, once again above asking price. This time, it was a first-time buyer who wanted to move quickly, and as the house we had just purchased was empty, the chain was short. We accepted straight away and began to prepare for the paperwork. A few months passed and we were starting to pack the house up one evening when the doorbell rang. It was my neighbor. We hadn't spoken too much before, but she had been cleaning out our loft and came across an old journal. She explained that the journal was written by a lady who once lived in my house many years before and thought that I would like to read through it. I thanked her and took her up on her offer. That night after dinner, I sat at the dining room table and began to flick through the journal. I turned a few pages before suddenly being stopped in my tracks. Right there, in front of me, was a portrait of the woman that I had been seeing in our house. Underneath the painting, it read, Jane Smith. I continued over to the next page. June 16th, 1856. Today, I laid my sweet child to rest. And I just couldn't read anymore. Leo, get in here. I shouted at him through the living room doors. My husband, too, couldn't believe his eyes. Everything I had told him about this woman was now written in this diary that had been handed to me by our neighbor. I spent the rest of the night delving deeper into her story to find out that she married a noble man and went on to be what some might say famous in the Victorian era. Because of this, she was pretty easy to find on Google, and a few universities in the area had done some studies on her life. I spent hours researching this woman, and I came across something quite eerie. Minus the fame, her and I hadn't lived too much of a dissimilar life. We had the same family setup, both experienced hard times, and had lived in similar areas. Obviously, we also lived in the same house, and all of these, though, were just coincidences, I thought. Until I saw a study paper online. It read that after living at our current house, she too moved to North Wales with her husband. But not only did she move to North Wales, she moved to the exact same town that we were buying our new home in. I was officially creeped out. Was this woman following me? Or was I following her? Or was I her in a past life and I'm now reliving this life in a different timeline? Were we related, or is this all just a big coincidence? A million questions flooded through my mind, and in a panic state, I slammed the diary shut and promptly took it back to the neighbor, never wanting to look at it again. After this, the house sale went pretty smoothly. I never saw the woman again, and we moved into the derelict cottage in North Wales. We were busy renovating the new house, and we didn't know much about the history of the house and suspected it to be around 300 years old. I did some digging and found out that the house was used in the World Wars as a safe house to house children from Liverpool. And that is exactly what this house is, a safe house. We've now lived here for 3 years and felt nothing but safe. We've transformed this house into a home, and even though no neighbors and we're in the middle of nowhere, it can seem a bit creepy at times. The second our doors are locked, we feel so safe and protected by this home. That was until about a fortnight ago. Me and my husband went for a short walk to a cemetery down the road from here. Admiring the old headstones, we were reading out the names of the people who laid to rest there. And then we saw it. Jane Smith died 1868, followed by the name of our current house. Remembering the ghost my roommates and I lived with years ago. After my freshman year of college, my randomly assigned roommate turned best friend and another girl on our floor who we became very close with in the dorms all decided to rent a house together the following year. The other girl, her stepdad flipped houses and had recently renovated this place that was 2 blocks from campus. It was a 3-bed that cost us about $300 or maybe $400 a month each. It was really affordable for a bunch of 19-year-olds. The house itself was gorgeous, with a sunroom, a basement with a washer and dryer, 2 beds on the main floor with a bathroom, and basically an upstairs suite with a huge master and a walk-in closet, and a private bath. The other girl took that whole floor to herself since it was her dad's place and didn't pay rent because her family thought she was too busy with cheerleading and her sorority. That's a whole separate conversation leading up to why my best friend and I moved out. But the important thing is, my friend and I had the 2 main level rooms just off the living room with the bathroom between us. I don't even remember when the paranormal experiences started. I remember by October. We moved in August, by the way. In October, it was enough that our dumbasses did a seance and had already named our ghost Claire. With all the windows closed, we asked her a bunch of questions and she moved the candle different directions for yes and for no. Things were really bad for my friend and mildly annoying for me. This all happened on the main level and the third girl never experienced anything. My friend would experience sleep paralysis pretty frequently and wake up to a woman sitting on top of her or see her standing in the corner near her closet. The sink in the bathroom between our rooms would turn off and on all night. For me, she would open my door and get in bed with me. The funny thing is, at first, I didn't even realize it was the ghost doing that. The third roommate had a cat and I assumed the cat was in bed pretty often. After a while, when I would feel the weight pushing down in the bed, I would keep turning around and no one was there. I'd turn my back and a second later, the weight would get closer to me. Turn around, and nothing. I worked 12-hour shifts on Saturdays, and I would be so exhausted I just started to let it happen. It was so frequent, it wasn't even worth the fight to get up and close my door or to roll over and check the bed. I only saw her once. I was home alone and deep cleaning my room. The light was on in the living room, and my room created some sort of triangle of darkness in that short hallway. I was pulling the vacuum out of my room when, out of the corner of my eye, a woman with dark hair was standing behind me. She was so real. Both my roommates had dark hair too. She was so real that I jumped and said, "Oh my God, you scared me." As I was turning around, and when I finished turning though, no one was there. That was the first time Claire actually spooked me. My friend and I moved out a few months later due to a lot of issues with the third roommate. In the years following, whenever the experience gets brought up, my friend is near tears just talking about the terror that Claire put her through at night, whereas I joke often about how I had a ghost girlfriend cuddling with me at night. I don't know why she was so nice to me. In some ways, I feel bad that she revealed herself to me and I was scared of her. I don't know, she seemed harmless, just active. Then again, she was so awful to my friend, and that's also unexplainable. I think the funniest part of this story, though, is when constantly living with an active entity, you do eventually get used to whatever they're doing. Between nursing school for my friend and classes plus 30-hour weeks of work at a standing job, at some point, I need to sleep, no matter who's in my bed. This one's called My Husband's Story. This was about 2 years before we moved to the house that was featured in my previous post. And as mentioned in my previous post, my husband is a magnet for the paranormal. He's seen things for as long as he can remember and is still freaked out when things happen. Anyway, he had went to an abandoned hospital with a friend, and when they went in, it was broad daylight. Once they were inside the building, my husband kept track of any turns they made so they could make sure they went back the same way. As they were going through, he noticed bullet holes in the walls and bloodstains that looked like people had been dragged down the hallways. They saw things running around in their peripheral vision and had chairs rolling across the floors right in front of them. They even heard things running around. He said it could have been animals, but they never saw a single animal, so who knows. After that, he said things started to feel weird, and then they noticed it had gotten dark outside, but it didn't make sense to him because he felt like they were only there for maybe an hour. So they were ready to leave at that point, and he started following his notes to backtrack to get out, and once they reached what should have been the stairwell for them to leave, it ended up being nothing but a solid wall. He said he knew they were in the right spots because the graffiti on the wall around it was the exact same as it was when he saw it when they first came in. It caused them to panic, and they started trying to get out of any door that they could find. They came across a door that had a sign on it that said, "Do not enter, dead inside." It ended up just being the morgue, and they had to go through it to find the way out. The only door that he could force his way through was a door leading to the roof. Once they got outside, they had to go across the roof and down into a stairwell of another part of the hospital just to get out. He said it felt almost as if whatever was in there didn't want them to leave. This last part sounds a little crazy, but he swears by it. He said that when they got back to the car, he noticed he had dropped something and went back to look around the window for it. When he got back to the window, there was a little girl standing just inside and threw what he was looking for on the ground in front of him as she was telling him not to come back in. He grabbed it so fast he ended up tripping and actually tore something in his knee, and he still has problems from it to this day. Choose to believe it or not, he goes white as a ghost and starts sweating every time he tells the story. I had asked him to take me to check it out, and he refused to ever step foot back in there again. They had tried to tear it down for years, but every crew that went in would leave and refuse to go back. It wasn't until around 2 years ago that they successfully tore it down, and now it sits in piles with the parking garage still standing. If you made it this far, thank you for reading. I know it's long, but I wanted to get as many details in it as possible. And to add, coincidentally, he said the chapel felt the worst and the cremation chamber was the most peaceful. How odd. Trying to understand my first-hand interaction with what I think could be the occult. I've always believed in spirituality and supernatural existence, but I've never had such a direct and validating first-hand experience with it. In July of 2023, I was single and active on social media, dating apps, and stuff like that. I have an abundant mindset in dating, so I was messaging as many girls as possible while I was single and looking to mingle. I had a false and idiotic sense of safety, apparently. I added a girl that I had found on Tinder or something, but had never met in person on Snapchat, a normal occurrence during that time, unfortunately. Instantly, I watched her story and it was full of witchcraft, fortune-telling, and other stuff along those lines. Before I could even finish viewing the stories, I got a message that said, "Who's this?" Which is, of course, understandable. And before I had time to respond, the person, in under a minute of adding me, blurted out my grandmother's full name and address, her dog's name, my mom's legal name, my childhood address, my current address, and potentially other details that I had forgotten. They basically threatened me to leave them alone and that they knew all this because one of their minions follows me. Of course, someone could find these things if they had enough information, time, and a bizarre desire for personal details. But we're talking 20 to 30 seconds here. It was so fast, in fact, that I don't even think it could have normally been typed up as fast as it was sent. It was as if it was copied and pasted. This shook me up enough to block them instantly and go through my followers and block any minion-type people. My family, including myself, had fallen upon some bad fortune since then, and I can't shake the slight paranoia that perhaps this person had cast something onto us. If you have any insight, thoughts, or questions on this, please comment, as I want a better understanding of what I experienced. My grandpa most likely had a demon stuck to him. When I was a kid, I lived in an old rundown farmhouse and had experienced so many strange as well as scary encounters I could make a whole post about them. But I was laying in bed thinking about a time where I was physically attacked by one and how that's even possible. This takes place in a house in the city, not the farmhouse. I was a lot older, around 16, and I lived with my grandparents' house with my dad. There's some backstory on my grandparents that is needed. My grandpa and grandma were super religious, and my grandpa would talk about his childhood to me. He said his parents were religious and he hated it. He rebelled severely and dabbled into satanic stuff. Through his teens, he experienced items being thrown with intense force at him, his bed violently shaking, and just straight up torment from what he said were demons. He said he found God through all of that because a light that he called a guardian angel saved him from the terrors that he experienced. Anyway, Back to when I lived with him. It wasn't the same house that he experienced that, and they had crosses over every door frame and tons of religious stuff around the house for protection. A side thing that I experienced in this house to set the feeling that something wasn't right is that one day my dad randomly walks into my room, really annoyed, and says, "What?" I was so confused and I asked what he meant. He said I called him and then wasn't responding when he said what the first time, so he came in. I was watching YouTube with my headphones, so my room was dead silent, and when I kept persisting that I didn't, he looked so pale and so scared. He said 100% that he heard my voice call out to him. This happened 3 times in that house in different locations to different family members. We would hear a mimic, essentially, which is terrifying. So, about the physical incident. It was around Halloween, and I remember it so clearly. I was standing in the doorway of the kitchen and talking to my grandma, who was cutting some apples. We were talking about how candy apples are unsafe for trick-or-treating treats because of the razor blades, when all of a sudden I feel a super hard shove on my left shoulder, hard enough to throw my body forward and off balance. I was petrified, to be honest. I looked behind me and no one was there. I tried to convince myself that maybe the hood on my hoodie fell and I just overreacted. I looked at my grandma and she was just staring at me. I asked her, "Did you not just see me get pushed like there was someone behind me?" And she just continued staring while saying nothing and then turned away and continued cutting apples. She had such a blank expression. I feel like she knows what happened but ignored it as a way to cope because maybe this happens a lot. Thinking back, maybe it was pushing me out from under the cross. I don't know, but I think that was the most horrifying encounter I ever had because although all of my other experiences were scary and caused my body to react when I hear ghost stories, this was the only encounter that I had, and I'm so glad that I moved out as quickly as I did. Grandpa definitely had demons that never left from when he was a kid. Real incident that I experienced when I was 10 years old. I'm from Asia and have a deep fascination with the supernatural. I've been reading ghost stories posted in this community for quite some time now, and I've enjoyed a lot of them. However, today I'd like to share an incident that happened with me when I was 10 years old. English is not my first language, so I apologize for any grammatical errors in advance, but here is what happened. This incident took place when I was 10. This was in 2001, and I was living with my maternal uncle and his wife, as my school at the time was just 5 minutes away from their home. My uncle's wife had given birth to their second child, and another one of my aunts had decided to stay with us to help my uncle and aunt manage things. We used to sleep in the same room as there were 3 beds in the room arranged in a U shape. My aunt and her newborn child used to sleep in one bed. My other aunt and the first child used to sleep on the second bed, and me and my uncle would sleep on the third one. One night, my uncle woke me up and he looked pretty excited. I was still half asleep and I didn't understand what was happening. He said that I needed to get up quickly as someone was here to meet me. I thought it was already morning and that my parents had come to see me, and I got excited and sat up pretty quickly, and what I saw completely puzzled me. Both my aunts were sitting together on the bed opposite of mine, and my uncle went to join them and sat next to my aunts. As soon as I got up, there was a girl standing in front of them. She looked like she was 16 or 17 years old, and she was smiling at me. She started walking towards me. This scared me, and I jumped and stood over my bed. She tried to climb over the bed, but I pushed her and she fell down. She got up, looked at me, and started trying to get on the bed again, and I pushed her back again. This happened for a third time too, and I got really scared. The fact that my uncle and aunts were watching all this quietly freaked me out. When she got up the fourth time, I closed my eyes and joined my hands in prayer and started praying out loud. After a few moments of praying, I felt someone's hand on my shoulder, and for a moment, I thought that girl caught me, but when I opened my eyes, it was my uncle. He asked me why I was standing on my bed and praying out loud so loudly in the middle of the night. They assumed that I was sleep-talking, but I explained to them that I wasn't, and I told them the whole incident. They comforted me and tried to make me go back to bed and fall asleep, but the fear of what just happened prevented me from going back to sleep that night. At that time, they convinced me it was just a bad dream, but when we talk about the incident now, they admit that they all believe in the supernatural, and what I saw that night could be 100% real. I know that there's little scientific proof that spirits exist, but I truly believe that I wasn't dreaming that day, and whatever I saw was real. First time sharing my experience. I had a weird situation once. I was around 16 or 17 years old, and one day I had heard that an old man nearby neighborhood had died. I wasn't really sure who exactly it was, because in the same building there were 3 other people in the same age that were living there, but the descriptions were leading me to one of them. The next day, while they were getting ready for the funeral, I pass outside the building as I was returning from coffee with my friends, and I see the old man that my friends had described to me outside the building, sitting in his usual position, smoking his pipe and staring at the road as I pass. I was creeped out a little bit. I didn't talk to him, and I moved on thinking that clearly he must not have been the one that I thought had died. Apparently, 10 years have passed and I never saw that old man sitting in his usual spot, smoking his pipe. I tried to talk to my friends about this, but no one actually believes me. I try from people who knew him to describe him, and all the information that I get points out to the man that I saw that day. Was it a coincidence? Was it someone that looked like him? I guess I'll never know. But the evidence and the descriptions so far points out that I had one of the weirdest encounters ever. Man in a suit carrying chains. This is my brother's experience, and he's told me the story numerous times before, and it sounded pretty cool, so I thought I'd share here. My brother lived in one of my grandmother's abandoned houses when he was only 16. He liked the sense of independent living. Many strange things occurred in the house before, but on one particular night, it got insane. My brother explained that he was sitting on his bed, relaxing, playing his game, when his dog started growling and foaming at the mouth while looking at the screen door to the backyard. He then tried to calm him, but nothing would work. He got a feeling that something wasn't right and decided to check it out for himself. He went into the backyard and saw what he described as a tall man in a suit standing in the beat-up shed across the yard. He heard chains rattling, although we had no chains in the yard. He immediately ran back into the house and locked the door. His dog calmed down a bit, and an hour later, his TV shut off randomly, so he got up to turn it back on, only for it to shut off again. His dog started growling once more. He then heard my grandmother call his name from the living room, but the problem is, my grandmother wasn't there. He left his room to check the back window once more, and when he did, the man was standing right in front of him. He then left the house and started walking towards the back of the road, which is a woodsy area. He said he heard a voice say, "Yeah, go that way." So he turned around to go the opposite way. As he was walking toward the street, he heard the voice again, "Yeah, go that way." And he stopped in his tracks to call my mother to come over and pick him up. He stood under a neighbor's magnolia tree and said that's the only place that he felt any peace from the eeriness. My mother arrived and she didn't believe him. She brought over some laundry to dry because our dryer had been broken during this time. And my brother refused to go back inside the house and he stayed in her car. He told me about it while we were in the car, and the next thing you know, she was running back out to us in the car. When he asked what was wrong, she told him that she heard chains coming from the attic. She didn't think anything of it at first until she heard my grandmother call her name from the living room. And when she walked into the living room, she heard a little girl say, "Help me." Then she said, "Him." As they were riding back to my mother's house, they both felt uneasy. My mom said she was constantly watching the back seat and felt as if someone might have been following them home. Later that night, and I also witnessed this too, there was a slender, dark figure resembling a female squatting on top of our fridge. We all left and ran back to our rooms. My brother slept in my other brother's room with him, and my other brother woke up seeing someone scratching on the corner of his room. When he got up to turn on the lights, no one was there, but the scratch marks remained. Whatever it was followed us home, and we've never seen or encountered anything like this since that night. Who was singing? About 2 years ago, when I was 24, my best friend, then 23, and I were at her parents' duplex, located just a street away from my own parents' house. We often spent our free time there, whether after work, school, or on the weekends. Her bedroom was on the top floor. One evening, we were expecting her 14-year-old brother to return from school by 6:15 p.m., and it was only 6 p.m., so we knew he couldn't have arrived home just yet. Surprisingly, we heard what sounded like him entering the lower apartment, opening the door, and started to sing, which was something he normally did anyway. Despite calling out to him multiple times, he kept singing without responding to us. Feeling a bit annoyed, as we had wanted him to run to the nearby store for some food, we initially brushed it off with laughter, intending to tease him later for ignoring us. A bit of context about the lower apartment: it consisted of a kitchen, a bathroom, one large living room, and one small living room, and the bedrooms of her parents and her brother. I've always found the area near the kitchen and the larger living room to be, unsettling. It felt perpetually dark, regardless of how many windows were open or how many people were present. I rarely ventured into that part of the house as it never felt right to me, even for something as simple as praying. Returning to the incident, just a few minutes before we planned to go downstairs, the intercom rang. Assuming it was her brother, still engrossed in his singing, we called for him to answer it. Receiving no response, we went down ourselves, only to find that nobody was there. It turned out that her brother, who we thought had been the one home singing, was actually the one who rang the intercom. He had just returned from school at around 6:12 p.m., which made sense considering he had stopped to chat with friends, and the keys that he mentioned were left inside, which I verified. My friend, preferring not to dwell on the particular experience, given her residency in the home, initially avoided discussing it any further. However, we eventually had to acknowledge it. It was an experience that we both shared, making it impossible to simply dismiss as a hallucination lasting for about 10 minutes. Yet, we found ourselves unable to fully explain it. Did anyone ever play this game? I was a 90s kid, so before cell phones and exploring the dangers of the World Wide Web, during sleepovers, we would play scary games to freak each other out. I remember being invited to a friend's birthday sleepover one night when I was in the 3rd grade. Me and a group of other girls from our class sat in her living room in a circle with 2 girls in the middle. One girl would sit with her legs crossed, hands over her tightly shut eyes, and the other girl would sit behind her, repeating a story. The rule was that the room had to be mostly dark and that it had to be late at night if this was going to work. As the storyteller told a story about you being lost in the woods and coming into contact with a man, from what I remember was probably a priest in the story. It's been a while. They would trace out the directions that you took trying to find your way out of the forest. And by the way, we lived in a heavily Catholic St. Louis where there were very dense areas of foliage, so it was real to us. At the end of the story, the priest turns out to be a bad dude, and he stabs you in the back. You were supposed to be able to then lift the back of the victim's shirt to see scar marks from where you had been stabbed. This night, I was the storyteller. One of the sweetest girls in our class was the victim, and I remember going through the whole story and drawing out all the directions on her back. I was a nail biter, and still am to this day, so I know it wasn't me that did this to her. But as soon as I finished, we lifted the back of her shirt, and at first, we didn't see anything. And then another girl yelled, "Oh my God, look at her shoulder." Starting at her left shoulder blade and slowly appearing diagonally down her back was a long red line, like a scratch, and then another across the bottom of her back and one down the middle. I can't explain how this happened. I just know that we all saw it. We all freaked out, and one girl was so afraid she called her mom to come get her, and she left in near hysterics. We never spoke about what happened that night again, and as far as I know, the victim, her name was Emma, wasn't affected any further, and the next morning when we checked her back again, the marks were gone. But it's something that I have never forgotten, and I think about from time to time. So, did anyone else ever play this game as a kid and have a similar experience? Any advice? I've had a suspicion that something paranormal is attached to my mom. This feeling dates back to my middle school years, and despite living separately now, I'm 23 and live on my own, my mom continues to experience strange occurrences. For instance, around the age of 11, while living in a condo with just my mom, our bedrooms were connected by a bathroom in a Jack and Jill style. Frequently, in the middle of the night, I'd hear the sound of my mom's flat iron cord hitting the bathroom cabinets. It's a sound I recognized from her morning routine. Additionally, she reported hearing scratching noises on the walls of her bedroom. I moved in with my dad from the ages of 12 to 17 and didn't encounter anything unusual, and I'm not sure if my mom had any experiences during that time living alone. Upon moving back with her at 17, in a new condo shared with her then husband, who worked night shifts, I encountered several unexplainable events. An old VCR player in my room would turn on and rewind by itself, despite being unplugged. One night, as I was nearly asleep, I felt what seemed like a hand slapping my cheek lightly 2 times. My small dog would occasionally growl at something invisible, and when I wasn't home, my mom and stepdad would hear voices coming from my room. My mom also experienced hearing a man's voice greeting her at night and feeling a presence sitting on her bed, even causing it to dip, as well as feeling the end of her bed being lifted and shaken when she was alone. After moving out at 19 with my boyfriend, who is now my husband, I haven't experienced anything similar. However, my mom, living in a different place with her current boyfriend, continues to witness, let's call them odd occurrences. Her boyfriend once saw 2 bare footprints appear in a freshly mopped floor while home alone, despite always wearing shoes indoors. My 3-year-old sister once pointed and laughed at something unseen over my mom's shoulder. Additionally, her boyfriend woke up feeling scratched on his back, finding red scratch marks the next morning, even though my mom was sleeping away facing from him. There are more incidents, but these stand out to me the most. I've heard that discussing paranormal activity can intensify it, yet these persistent events, always around my mom, suggest that something is attached to her. I'm unsure how to address or resolve the issue. Any thoughts? Red shoes. My grandpa lives in an older house by himself. My grandma passed away in August of 2021, leaving behind a house full of old antiques. Each room is filled with all sorts of things, from old glassware to old bonnets that ladies and girls would used to wear. She collected many different things. She was a hoarder, but she kept her house clean and her antiques organized. Anyway, throughout the years of her collecting, strange things would happen. They would hear whispering, see people that they can't explain in their house, and after a while they got used to it. Since she's passed away, he's continued to have paranormal experiences. This experience happened recently. There are 3 bedrooms in the house. My grandpa used to sleep in the bedroom in the back, but ever since my grandma passed, he's moved himself to the bedroom up front. He figured that it's easier for him to get to the bathroom. One night, he got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. He's very used to paranormal things happening to him, but this experience, he said, actually scared him. He started walking to the bathroom and stopped dead in his tracks. In front of him stood a woman. He said she was wearing a white dress with red shoes. She had blonde hair that was tied back, and he stood there as she walked towards him and didn't say a word. She didn't say anything to him as she walked towards him. The next thing you know, she vanished right before his eyes. He stood there for a few seconds, wondering what the F just happened, and he told me that after he witnessed that, he no longer had to go to the bathroom. He hadn't seen her since. I asked him if she looked transparent or did she look like a regular person, and he said that she didn't look transparent and that she looked like a random person that was just walking towards him in his house until she disappeared, that is. He said that this really spooked him, and he hopes that he never sees her again. I have plenty of other experiences from me and other family members that I plan to share. This next story is from the same person. It's called Baby Monitor. This is my grandpa's story. My grandma passed away in 2021 of cancer. But before this, my grandpa took care of her in their house before she passed. In order for him to do chores around the house or backyard, He had to put a baby monitor in the living room so that he could hear if my grandma needed anything. After she passed, he decided to keep it in the living room so he could hear if someone broke into his house, since he now lived alone and his hearing isn't the best. He kept the other half of the monitor in his room when he slept. He told me he would sometimes hear voices coming from the living room at night through the monitor. He could never decipher what they were saying. It sounded like chatter that he couldn't understand. He got used to this until one night he heard a familiar voice come through. He was laying in bed trying to fall asleep, and then he heard my grandma's voice call for him. He heard, "Jerry, Jerry." He was shocked to hear her voice calling his name. He got up out of bed to check in the living room, and for a split second, he forgot that she had passed. Once he got into the living room, he didn't see anyone there. He was creeped out and then went back to bed. He hasn't heard her voice ever since. He's had many paranormal experiences in his house, and so have I and my grandma, so I believe him when he told me that he heard my grandma's voice. Something wanted me to go downstairs. I used to live in this house from when I was in pre-K until the 3rd grade. I often had weird, scary dreams and would see dark figures at night as I lay awake trying to sleep. I attributed these experiences to reading Goosebumps and my imagination running wild from those stories. However, one night, something happened that still gives me chills to this day, and I've only ever shared it with my mom. It was the weekend, and my sisters were at my cousin's house for a sleepover, leaving just my mom and me in the house. Unable to sleep, I was up watching TV while my mom, exhausted from working 2 jobs, was asleep in her room. Eventually, feeling tired, I went to lie down in my bed. Our bedroom connected my room with my mom's and my sister's room. As I lay there, unable to sleep, the bathroom door from our side opened and a voice asked me, "Hey, can you do me a favor and go downstairs to the basement to get me some toilet paper?" Fearing the basement, an old, dark, cold space with nothing in it, I thought it might have been my mom and replied, "There's toilet paper in there." I remembered putting a new roll on before she went to bed. Getting up with the lights off in both my room and the bathroom, I saw a dark figure sitting on the toilet. I quickly turned on the light, wondering what my mom was doing sitting in the dark, only to find nothing there. Confused and thinking I was just tired, I then heard noises coming from the basement. Standing at the top of the stairs, I saw what looked like children playing in the dark. The light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, but it didn't occur to me to turn it on. Thinking my sisters might have returned without my noticing, I called out, "What are you guys doing down there?" A voice that sounded like my sisters replied, "We're playing hide and seek. Come on down if you want to play." I asked for the light to be turned on since I couldn't see the stairs, but I received no response. After seeing a black shadow at the bottom of the stairs that didn't move or speak, I quickly shut the door and ran to my mom's room to explain what happened. My mom believed me and never dismissed my story as make-believe. I also told her about the bad dreams and the shadows that I would see flying and running around my room. That night, she had me sit in the dark while she prayed over me and my family sitting next to me. I rebuked everything that I could think of. Since that day, I've never experienced anything similar, and I'm 30 now. The girl walking on the power pole wire. I'm originally from California. My entire family resides in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we moved when I was about 2 to a small town in Texas. So, as I like to say, I'm a Cali-made, Texas-raised. Although some of my father's siblings moved with us due to better job opportunities, we still made frequent visits and often spent a majority of our summers on the West Coast. Every visit was an adventure. Some of the most bizarre experiences of my young adult life happened during my summers in Cali. There's one memorable moment that always stood out to me and my cousins. It's one of our staple memories that we often discuss and now, as adults, try to figure out. One summer, when I was about 11 or 12, my cousins and I spent most of our days outside my grandmother's house, which was next to an apartment complex in Lawndale, California. Being bored was always the beginning of many great adventures. On this particular afternoon, my cousins and I decided to play Charmed. It was a game where my girl cousins and I played as witches with powers, and our boy cousins would be the demons. It sounds silly, but it was like tag, but in teams with make-believe powers. As we played, we saw a little girl looking at us from above. She had blonde, short, curly hair and wore a nightgown. She stared at us with some kind of uneasy grin and what I can only describe as a loud stare while standing near a rail on the 3rd floor. I say loud stare because when I became uncomfortable and broke eye contact, I looked back to find all my cousins just gazing up at her, also mesmerized. It might also be important to note that I was the second oldest in the group of 6, with ages ranging from 12 to 6 years old. For some reason, it felt wrong, so I yelled out, "Hey!" and they all looked at me. I knew something was wrong because my little cousins didn't speak or react. The apartment complex was open and exposed to the outside, so from my grandma's backyard, I could see the 2nd and 3rd floors and all the doors that led to the apartments. When we turned around, the girl was on the 2nd floor, closer to us. My older cousin and I shared a look of despair. We knew that something was off. At the moment, we didn't question how she moved so quickly. We didn't want to scare the kids. She still had the same stare and look on her face, though. And without breaking her grin, she asked if she could play with us. My older cousin and I told her no, and for some reason, we both rudely cursed her out. I should also mention that I'm Mexican American, and in our culture, we're taught to curse out bad spirits, and I think my older cousin and I knew that something wasn't human about this girl. The energy just felt heavy, and at this point, my younger cousins seemed frozen in fear. Immediately after we cursed her out, we experienced a blackout, which is common in LA. It wasn't the first time we'd experienced one, but what happened next was unexplainable. When we looked back, the young girl was walking on the utility pole electric wire. We could see her squatting over, almost like an owl, and she stared at us, then continued to stand up and walk away. We all ran inside, and shortly after the lights came back on, we never saw that little girl again. My grandmother had several friends who lived in that apartment complex, and no one knew who she was or from what apartment she came. She simply was never seen again. The Soldier. This is my dad's story. With all the weirdest things that have happened, this one takes the cake. My dad doesn't really speak of many paranormal experiences. This one freaked him out enough, though, that he told me. One night, he went to bed with my mom and their dogs. My dad falls asleep pretty fast, but for some reason that night, he couldn't. Some background info. My parents at the time had 2 cats, Sweet Pea and Baby Princess. My sister named them when she was 6. Their cats would sometimes go into their room when they were sleeping. My parents also slept with their door open, and their room is the first room when you would reach the top of the steps. Anyway, my dad was laying in bed, tossing and turning. He flipped on his back and closed his eyes. When he was laying there, he felt a pressure going up his legs. He figured it was just the cats. He then realized the pressure was going up his legs and then ended up to his chest. He couldn't move a muscle. That's when he started to choke. His eyes popped open and he looked over, and there was a figure standing over him with his hands around my dad's throat. According to my dad, the figure had a black World War II Nazi uniform and a black hat that had a swastika on it. The choking lasted for some time until my dad told it to get the F off of him, and then it disappeared. My dad was freaked out. He got up and checked inside all of our bedrooms and throughout the house, but he couldn't find anyone anywhere. Everyone was still asleep. I asked my dad why he thought the Nazi was choking him, and he said he wasn't sure why. Maybe he was an old, angry relative. My grandma grew up in Germany through the war, and my grandma's dad was a Nazi. So to say the least, we had some relatives that were in the war. I'm not sure why this ghost attacked my dad. Maybe because he was the strongest in the house? Who knows? My dad isn't one to make up stories like this, so I do believe him. He's a very strong and brave man, and it takes a lot for him to get scared. He told me that this really got to him and that he was scared for us, and this is why he got up and searched throughout the house. Usually, if paranormal things do happen, he doesn't say much because he didn't want to scare us when we were kids. And I know that some of you think that he had sleep paralysis when this happened, but my dad never suffered from this. He told me that this was the first and only time where he was unable to move. My experience. I was a freshman in college in Tallahassee, Florida during the 2017-2018 school year. Let me preface this by saying I never believed in the supernatural or paranormal prior to my experiences there. The summer after my high school graduation, many of my friends had to take a mandatory summer term as a sort of orientation at FSU. I went to the community college to transfer, so I didn't have to. I went to visit for a weekend to kind of get a feel for the city before I moved up in the fall. And while I was staying in my friend's, soon-to-be roommate's, dorm room, he woke me up on his way to his morning class, so I figured I would take a walk around the campus. When I entered the stairwell, I noticed the initials TB written on the window like someone would with their finger against the morning dew. I figured it was some type of tradition that the kids did, so I tried to write my own initials, except I couldn't because they were written from the outside. That was on the 3rd floor of a stairwell. I didn't know anything about Ted Bundy besides him being a serial killer, and had no clue that his killings were in Tallahassee or that there were any ghost stories attached either. Well, fast forward to the fall semester, and we lived in a house just across from San Luis Park, which was a nature trail attached to a historic mission from the 1800s. The whole trail is a complete circle with paths that branch off toward the center if you want to cut through it quicker, except for one spot where there's a perfect fork in the road. I remember being with 2 of my roommates walking our dog along the trail when we came across it. We stood there for about a minute or so deciding which way to go, but I looked up and there was a Grim Reaper doll sitting on a tree branch about 30 to 40 feet up in the air. I thought nothing of it at the time, as it looked like it could have just been a Halloween decoration. But why someone would go through all the trouble to put it up there, I haven't the slightest idea. I mean, the tree stood about 15 feet behind the fork with thick brush in between. Then, Hurricane Irma hit us. When I got back to Tallahassee, the first thing I did was go down the trail to see if it was still walkable. I arrive at the fork and I noticed that the tree is still there, but the Grim Reaper isn't. So I decided to look around a little bit for it. It took me about 5 minutes and I was about to give up, right when I told my roommate, "Dude, where the F is it?" I look up and there it is. Not laying on the ground, but sitting perfectly upright on the branch that had been knocked clean off the tree. Again, I didn't believe in the paranormal, so I took it home with me, as I figured it would make a nice addition to the house. And boy did it. The roommate in the master bedroom was the resident stoner of the house, so we would always partake in our herbs and wax in there. One day, I was out of class early and home before anyone else, so I went in there to roll up. As I'm rolling, I noticed the box fan on his nightstand started rocking back and forth a little bit. My instinct was to call his dog, but he was downstairs at the time, so my next thought was, did a rat just run by and hit the power cord or something? I got down on my hands and knees, face against the floor, and I scanned the whole room. Nothing. His bed was raised, and his dressers were raised, and I could see the whole floor from where I was, and I was alone. As I'm getting up and walking back to the table, I hear something, so I turn around. Something pushed the door open, and I still don't know what it was. A few months go by, and not much happened in between, but I do remember looking in the woods directly adjacent to our house. The trail where I found the doll was on the opposite side of the street, by the way. There were decades-old beer cans and plastic bottles, but I found an old sword just sitting there. So I took it home because who doesn't want a sword, right? Now it's the end of the spring semester, and we're all getting ready to move out. This is when the weird stuff starts happening. We had a ton of stuff that we were just going to throw out, so we got the sword out and started doing what guys do best. And sure enough, the decrepit old thing breaks right off the hilt, but that wasn't going to stop us. One of my friends grabbed the bare blade and basically cut his palm open while he was messing with it. We go back inside and sit up on the counter next to the sink while we put pressure on the cut to stop the bleeding. It was a pretty nasty gash that needed stitches, but he ended up completely going limp and pretty much falling over, banging his head on the cabinet. He woke up shaking and covered in sweat. He isn't hemophobic, and he definitely didn't lose that much blood, so it was just a very weird thing. Now, it's move-out time. Everything was put into a U-Haul, and we were sleeping on bedrolls in the living room for our last night. There were 6 of us, plus 3 friends from back home, all waiting downstairs for the Ubers to show up and take us to the bars. While we're waiting, there's a loud boom from upstairs. It was directly above us, coming from the master bedroom. It sounded like a bowling ball had been rolled off the bed. I went upstairs to check it, but the room was empty. Nobody in it, no thing in it. Everything was in the U-Haul already, and it was an empty room. I figured that was the ghost's way of saying, "Bye guys, thanks for being good sports." It's been 7 years, and that noise still haunts me to this day. Ghost in my apartment? Almost every night, I hear the same haunting classical song. It's so soft that sometimes I feel as if I'm imagining it. Sometimes I hear the sounds of children roughhousing in my closet, which is peculiar since it doesn't share a wall with any of my neighbors. I also experience vibrations in the walls, but I can't definitively say that they originate from the walls themselves. More accurately, when I'm sitting at my table, I can hear buzzing coming from the direction of the wall. However, there's nothing in my house that would produce such vibration noises. I've tried convincing myself that these noises are from my neighbors, but truthfully, I've been hearing them in other places too. For instance, when I'm at work on my break, I hear a tiny buzzing from the window or the wall, resembling the sound of my phone going off, prompting me to always check it. It's happened too frequently to be a coincidence, and I wonder if I'm going crazy or perhaps my deceased aunt is attempting to communicate with me. Additionally, I hear a bell ringing in my kitchen, always ringing the same number of times and in the same rhythmic pattern. Despite placing my ear against the wall in various spots, I can never locate the source. I've also been waking up in the middle of the night to see a black figure standing there. Last night, it frightened me so much that I had to reach out and make sure that it wasn't real. Just typing this out gives me the heebie-jeebies. Am I simply experiencing a series of coincidences? Or am I actually haunted by ghosts? The uninvited guest at a school trip. The year was 2000. Our all-girls school trip to a hill station was a whirlwind of excitement. 3 days, 4 nights, packed with sightseeing and cultural events. On the first evening, a fun-filled program kept most of us entertained. 3 classmates, however, opted to skip it due to travel fatigue. The second night, after a day of exploration, we huddled in our room, 8 of us. Spooky stories, a staple of school outings, filled the air. Laughter and goosebumps danced in the flickering lamplight as the clock struck 3 a.m. before we finally drifted off to sleep. Around 4 a.m., a chilling sound shattered the silence. Short, periodic bursts of laughter. It was M, the resident prankster. But something was off. Her laughter lacked its usual warmth, replaced by an unsettling emptiness. We thought it was a joke, but a slap on the arm from S didn't faze her. The laughter morphed into rapid-fire gasps. By 4:30 a.m., our bed began to vibrate violently. Panic surged. Was somebody having a seizure? Flicking on the light, we witnessed a horrifying sight. M's body contorted in unnatural tremors. Little P bravely reached out to comfort her, but M lunged with her teeth bared. We scrambled to pull P back as M, in a frenzy, tore into the mattress, leaving a smear of blood. The convulsions subsided, leaving her collapsed and eyes rolled back. Fear, cold, and suffocating gripped us. We alerted our teachers and the school principal, who's a revered nun. They rushed in and offered prayers, blessing the room. M, drained but peacefully, slept deeply. Later, the principal questioned us about the night's events. We confessed to the ghost stories, and shockingly, the 3 girls who missed the cultural program revealed a secret. They had a Ouija board session. They used a chart paper and summoned a spirit that wouldn't leave. After much pleading, they managed to send it back, but perhaps it lingered. Notably, M was sleeping on the exact spot where the board had been placed. The next day, M awoke with a fever, oblivious to the night's horrors. The incident left an indelible mark on us, a chilling reminder of the unforeseen sources that sometimes lurk in the shadows. According to the comments in this post, M was oblivious for a very long time, and according to Facebook, she's now doing good. Ghosts in my uni library. So I have this particular study spot in my uni library that I sometimes study at. It's sort of in a more secluded area where usually not many people study at. To give you a visual picture, it's in front of a wall, so all I see is the wall in front of me, and then next to me are more desks and chairs. I normally only go there when the library is pretty full and I can't find any other spots. The last time I was studying there, I saw from the corner of my eye someone standing there, but I didn't think much of it since it's a library. I thought someone just stood there and was looking at the books. This person, however, stood there for so long, and I felt like their body was facing me and they were maybe looking at me, but I couldn't really tell because it was out of the corner of my eye. So I eventually turned to my right, but to my surprise, no one was there. I wasn't freaked out. I was just genuinely confused as to why there was nobody there. You know how you sometimes just feel the presence of someone? This happened to me a couple of times after that too, where I thought someone was walking by, and I was so sure of it too, but I brushed it off, saying that my mind was playing tricks on me after I saw the first person. Today I went to the library to study again, and I sat at a different spot. Strangely, all of my electronic devices suddenly stopped working. My phone suddenly had no reception for 10 minutes straight. My laptop just had a blank screen. My iPad saying every website that I tried to visit was dangerous, and this has never happened to me before. I got really frustrated and went to change my study spot. I was walking around for ages, even though the library was pretty empty, and I somehow ended up at that spot. I settled down and suddenly everything started working again. So I continue studying and the same thing happens again. I'm so sure that someone is standing there. I look to my right, but no one's there. To demonstrate how clearly I could see these people from the corner of my eye, at some point a real human was standing there, and my mind played it off as, yeah, this is one of those things you keep seeing. And after I look, it's a real human. I think it's strange how this only happens at this particular spot, and I never have experienced anything like this before. What are your thoughts, and what do you think this could be? This person did a little bit of research on their school and their library. The library was built in 1981, and in their research, there was nothing outstanding about it. We still don't know what's going on in that library. I'm a believer. This is my ghost story. Growing up in the 1970s, my parents hired a maid. This was a common thing. Black women took the bus to the suburbs, they donned white maid uniforms, and worked for upper-middle-class white families. Becky had been with the family since the early 60s, and she worked for my grandparents as well. I'd often see my grandfather waiting for Becky at the corner bus stop when I was riding to school in the morning. Becky was truly part of our family. She worked for my grandparents 2 days a week, and for us, another 2 days a week. I was always a little jealous of her third family, where she worked a separate 2 days a week. I didn't know them, but I felt like Becky belonged to me. My name is Rebecca. I was supposed to be called Becky, but when our Becky came to work for us, it would have been too confusing, so I always was Rebecca. Becky was a kind, gentle soul. She always put candy under our pillows. She cleaned our rooms, and if she found coins or money in our clothes, she ironed the bills and stacked the coins in a neat pile on our dresser. At Christmas time, she gave me and my sister gifts. She was so sweet and thoughtful. She loved us. Becky and her adult nieces, Linda and Sylvia, babysat us when my parents were on vacation. I was interested to see where Becky lived, and one day my mother took us downtown to her apartment. It was nice, the place where elderly people lived, a safe building. She lived up high, maybe on the 10th floor. But what struck me was that she had every single school photo of me and my two sisters framed and hanging on her walls. Like 20 or so school pictures of these white kids from the suburbs. We really were her family. My parents separated when I was 14, and my mother was absolutely despondent. She cried all the time. Becky, obviously concerned for me and my sisters, confided to us that her husband had left her many years prior, and she identified with my mother. Becky took care of my mom, comforting her, and it must have been hard for Becky to see our family dissolve this way. My grandfather, the one who would wait for her at the bus stop, had died the previous fall, and we were still in mourning over that. My mom's mom had died the previous August, so my mother was in a really bad state of mind. Becky was our rock, someone who arrived twice a week to keep our home running. Then, the unthinkable happened. In the summer of 1980, we returned home from summer camp. My mother told my sister to tell Becky that lunch was ready. My little sister, 11 at the time, came into the kitchen and said Becky is asleep with her eyes open. Mom and I just shot each other this knowing look. Mom ran downstairs to Becky while I dialed 0, because there was no 911 at the time. The paramedics took her to a hospital, and she died later that day from a stroke. We weren't allowed to see her in the hospital. We followed the ambulance, and they wouldn't let us in because we weren't family, but we were. Becky spent more time with us than her actual family. I saw her daughter and a few other family members behind the glass, and that was as close as we were allowed to be in her room. She was really brain dead by the time she went to the hospital, and I saw the paramedics try to revive her in our family room. She basically died in our home. So, why the long story, you ask? I had to give you some background. My mom finally started going out, trying to meet men. One night out of every weekend, I had to babysit my little sister, because my oldest sister was 18 and had moved out at the time. I wasn't happy about this because I was in high school and I wanted to be with my friends. While I was babysitting, I'd hear noises upstairs. I'd run upstairs and our dog would be asleep on the sofa and my little sister would be asleep in her bed. But I swore I heard footsteps. This kept happening and I'd tell my mother, but she never believed me. My mother and father reconciled briefly. He had moved back in, but I wasn't happy about it. He'd hurt my mom by having an affair. One night, while Dad was there, I heard this weird wailing. I thought it was the neighborhood fox, who routinely wailed at the moon, but this sound was much closer. I thought maybe the fox was on the side of the house, by the woods. As I tried to lift up my roller blind, I could hear his wailing. It was coming from above my head, in the attic. I got in bed, too afraid to tell my skeptical mother. I knew she wouldn't believe me. At breakfast, Dad said, "Did anyone hear that weird noise last night?" I said yes. I wasn't crazy. There was a weird noise. Dad said it was coming from the attic. He set animal traps up there, but there weren't any animals in the attic. Then Dad and Mom split up for good. I'd still hear the footsteps when I was alone in the house. Years went by. I moved out and got married. In 1992, I separated from my husband and moved in with my mother. My mother went to Florida for the winter and I was alone in the house. I started dating. One day, in the family room downstairs, my boyfriend said, "What the heck is that?" He heard footsteps. I was immune to him at this point, and I said, "I think it's Becky. She died in this house, and she loved us. If it is her, she's just here to watch over us." A couple of weeks went by. My boyfriend and I were in the living room having a romantic date by the fire, and the lights were off. There was just the light of the fire. He went upstairs to use the bathroom, and then he came out of the bathroom and I looked upstairs. He just stood there, frozen, with his eyes bugging out. I thought he was drunk. I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Didn't you see that?" I said, "What?" He told me, "A woman in a pink sweater just walked past you." I quickly looked around, but I didn't see anything. But I knew it was Becky. I'd never told my boyfriend that Becky wore a white maid's uniform and a pink cardigan. She wore that pink cardigan all the time. I called my mother to tell her, and she finally believed me. I forgot to mention, my father, my grandmother, and my sisters all went to Becky's funeral. My mother didn't go, though. Everyone there was under the impression that I was named after Becky. In truth, my mother told me that she named me after Becky Thatcher from Tom Sawyer, but I let Becky's family believe that I was named after her. It made them happy, and they told me how much Becky loved us. I knew that already, but it was nice to hear. This person includes an edit that says, "My mother sold the family home many years ago, and she sold it to a man named Wright. At some point, there was an open house, and my younger sister was in town and we went to the open house. I asked the woman who was renting if she had heard any strange noises, and she said no. Years go by. My son was in college in Gettysburg, which is about an hour and a half from Baltimore County where the house is located, and he met a young man named Clark in college. Clark didn't have a car. He learned that my son lived in Baltimore County and asked for a ride home from one of their school breaks. As they got closer to Baltimore, my son asked Clark where to go. He says, "Do you know where Charmouth Road is?" My son said, "Yes, I know exactly where that is." So they head down Charmouth Road. Clark says, "Turn left on the next street." And my son starts getting weirded out. Then Clark says, "I live at the last house on the right." It was my childhood home. Clark lived in my house, the Becky house. I've run into Clark several times since then. My son went to his wedding, and they're still good friends. They couldn't believe that they both lived in the same house. They even had the same room. Small world. I didn't have the nerve to ask Clark if he'd ever heard strange sounds. I wanted to, but I just couldn't ask him because I didn't want to embarrass my son. My mom said goodbye. My mom had been wheelchair-bound with bad hip issues my whole life. She always put up a good fight and a brave face despite constant pain because she had 2 kids to take care of, especially me, who was the youngest. She had been in and out of hospitals my whole life trying to fix her hip, but nothing had ever stuck, and I very rarely, if ever, saw her walk besides old pictures or videos. Unfortunately, her luck continued to go bad as she was dealing with cancer around 2016. Cervical cancer to be specific, and unfortunately, even though the cancer had been beaten, she had radiation too quickly and consecutively, and it did irreversible damage. It was a surprise to me that she was dying, and I didn't even have time to really grieve, because the time between finding out and her dying was within 24 hours. Well, I was rocked from this, and it messed me up for a while, but I remember that a few nights after she had passed, I had a dream about a house party. She was there, and I remembered her in her chair, but I remember, despite the dream vibe, where you don't usually remember much, I still remembered her grabbing me and made sure to tell me, "I love you," in a way that your parents or important people do when they really want to tell you something with urgency and clarity. It might not be much, and it could just be my own grief that influenced it, but I think if anything could prove an afterlife to me, it was that moment, and she chose a wonderful way of doing it. Farm located on a road named after a lost enslaved person's graveyard. In 2016, my husband and I purchased a foreclosed home on over 10 acres. When my friend sent me the listing, I saw the street name and was curious. I didn't know what it would actually mean in the near future. Now, I won't be posting the name of the street or the state that we live in just for safety reasons. Why? Well, I listen to too much true crime and I know better. You guys are some weirdos. Here's the history. The graveyard. My street is named after a long-lost graveyard that was the final resting place for many people in a small community of enslaved peoples. There's written and transcribed history of its location, but it's never been found, and all that remember its location have now passed on. The only major clue that we have is that it was marked by a large brown stone. In our area, stones and boulders are not common, so that would be a good landmark, but it's never been located. The reason this graveyard is notable is for one supposed resident. From my reading, he was a well-known enslaved man who became a soldier and later a talented author, publishing multiple books. His life is fairly well documented, but the end of his life is where the details begin to fray. Due to being forced into hiding, his whereabouts become hard to track. Some say he perished in Pennsylvania, while local lore insists that he died and was buried here. Other known residents, someone named Henny. There have been stories as well as information listed in records and maps of a descendant of enslaved people, a woman named Henny who also lived in this area. One of my neighbors, who's lived on this land since childhood, remembers her when she was alive. I have another neighbor who recently built his home on family land. One day, I had the pleasure of meeting his extended family. They were telling me about their history of the land when the eldest grandmother told me of her mother's cabin. She pointed into the woods nearby where I knew the ruins of a cabin were and said, "My mama and Mrs. Henny and I was born in a cabin right over there." Henny will become relevant here in a bit. Here's the spooky. I'm just going to list these in order. First was the distorted broadcast. We had to do a large amount of renovation when we bought the home, so we spent time there with very little furniture. No TV, no stereo, no radio. We used headphones for audio entertainment, but mostly it was very quiet there. I had been at the house all day and had been hearing this strange garbled sound. It was faint, but it sounded like you had an AM radio tuned between two stations. I could hear talking, but I couldn't understand the words, and there was static along with an occasional few notes of out-of-tune music. I had been hearing this all day and finally mentioned it to my husband when he came home. He sort of froze and stared at me. I said, "What?" He then told me that he had been out in the woods exploring and found an old glass tube radio. He, of course, thought that it was neat and brought it home. He put it in the basement just that morning. The next event I'll call the door. There's a door going between my basement to my garage that's large, heavy, and poorly fitted, and it's a pain to open and close. When you do close it, there's quite a big sound from the door squeezing into its almost too small frame. I've been home alone on multiple occasions when I know that door is closed, and I suddenly hear it close on its own without ever hearing it open. Another event is what I'll call the elemental. I consider myself sort of sensitive to things beyond the veil, enough so that I've educated myself on the different manifestations that can occur. I strongly believe that there's something that resides in my basement that isn't human. It's energy without a face, but a lot of opinions. We have experienced cold breezes, lights going off and on, and just a general feeling of F off. Not in a violent way, but in a I've manifested here, this is mine, get out kind of way. Some days it doesn't mind sharing space, and others you can feel it rushing and pushing you out of its area. It seems to mind me less than my husband and former dog walker. It could be who shuts and I assumes opens the door. Another event is what I'll call the lighter. My entire life I've believed in the paranormal, but I've never experienced something that I couldn't explain. But that changed in this house. My husband and I were cooking dinner when a series of strange events occurred. We had fully moved into the house and had the Alexa playing music. We were listening along when the song changed mid-chorus to Tequila Makes Her Clothes Fall Off. And this is gonna sound like I made it up, but I swear to you guys, this is what happened next. A bottle of Patron that had been sitting on the counter since our wedding a year earlier, it suddenly expelled its cork onto the counter. We both watched it happen. Taking my cue that something wasn't right here, I went to grab some sage from storage. Oh, how I thought that was going to help. I don't even know. From the kitchen, I hear my husband shout, "No, F this. Burn the whole house down." I come back in, confused, and he says while pointing to a one of two long-nosed lighters that we had on the counter because our stove wasn't lighting properly. He said, "That lighter just spun around on the table completely on its own." He was pointing to the purple lighter with a red one beside it. I was shocked and I rejected the idea as some sort of joke. I said, "No, it didn't. You're making that up." I finished my sentence and watched as right in front of me, the red lighter did its own spin as if spun by an invisible hand. That's one sight that I cannot explain or dismiss. Another incident I'll call the emergency. At 4 a.m., I was passed out on the couch and the house was quiet. Suddenly, there's loud banging and flashlights at my front door. I scream, and my husband comes running out of our room in his drawers and answers the door to 4 county police officers with their guns drawn. Once he verifies that he's the homeowner, they ask if anyone was in distress. We told them no and asked why. Well, apparently, the sheriff's department had received not 1 but 3 calls from our landline to 911 where they could only hear screaming. We don't have a landline phone. Worse more than that, the power company accidentally cut our physical landline cable in the ground just a year prior to this. Here's the event that brings Henny back to the situation. This story is borrowed from my neighbor who knew Henny. When my neighbor was a child, her father was a farmer and used to give Henny produce. Every day, Henny would walk 2 miles over fields and woods to pick up various veggies from his farm. Now, this wouldn't be that odd, but Henny was in her 80s and completely blind. Stories were told that Henny was actually a witch, and that's how she managed the journey without her sight. Even more stories about how her sight was lost. They said she was much younger when she found out that her husband had been having multiple affairs. To punish him, she cast a spell or brewed a potion that made him deaf, blind, and mute so that no woman would want him. The payoff for that spell was that when he died, she would also suffer one of the 3 fates. He died years later, and suddenly, she went blind. Many years later, after her passing, her cabin, still partially standing but mostly taken back by the woods, my neighbor and her brother were riding horses down the road. Suddenly, these calm, bomb-proof, quiet, sensible horses planted their feet and refused to move another inch. No matter what they did to push the horses forward, they pranced, they pawed, and they wanted to turn back down the road. When my neighbor looked to find what they were so upset about, she followed their gaze to the edge of the woods where the walls of Henny's cabin stood, and there, within a window, was Henny watching them with her milky blind eyes. Here's some smaller occurrences. Just weird things that have happened that don't have a whole story attached. One I'll call the barn. We cleared land and built a barn in 2019. Since then, I've heard the songs of a child and the voice of a man in the barn. Clear enough that I've gone looking for them. I don't know the workings of new structures attracting spirits, but we never experienced this before the barn was built. It seems that if there's a spirit of a female child, she likes the horses. I do find missing things in places that make no sense at all, like she's playing with me. I never hear the singing and the harsh male voice at the same time, so I don't think that they get on. Another event I'll call the light in the woods. When we moved to the property, there was no one around for acres and thick, mature forests surrounding us. We cleared some land for a paddock for our horses and then started noticing a warm orange light in the woods just beyond the fence line. I saw the light one night and insisted that we investigate it in case it was something or someone camping in our woods. My husband wasn't interested in seeing the spooky light in the woods and said that we should wait till daytime to go look. The next day, we hiked up there to see what it could be. We found the ruins of another cabin that we didn't know was there, exactly where the light was shining from, and we could still see the light. This next event I'll call Man in Overalls. Both my husband and I have seen some sort of out of the corner of our eye type of thing, an older black man with curly white hair wearing overalls. Usually, when we're out doing something on the land, we just see him walking on the farm like he has somewhere to be. No interactions, just a brief flash of him and movement, and then he's gone. There's more that I'm sure I've forgotten about or blocked out of my mind. I have a lot of interest in locating the graveyard and giving it and its residents the respect it deserves, as well as having a medium do a visit to our farm. If either of these things are something you have expertise in and would like to help or assist with and research with, please send this person a DM. I hope this was at least interesting, as I had some time at work and felt like typing this up. Ghost in the Bog. My family is originally from a small fishing village called Catalina, Newfoundland. About 4 or 5 miles north of Catalina is an even smaller village of Little Catalina. The surrounding area is covered in small ponds and bogs. In 1913, the town of Catalina held a dance for the local youth. My great-grandmother was about 13 years old at the time and was in attendance at this dance. According to her, a girl from Little Catalina came as well, walking the few miles. Her name has been lost to history, though. Well, that night it was unusually dark, and a fog rolled in off the North Atlantic. The dance finished at about 9 p.m. and everybody went home. My great-grandmother said that the next morning, the girls' parents were riding in their wagon, stopping at everybody's houses looking for their daughter, thinking that she may have stayed in Catalina with friends or relatives. One boy said that he saw her walking down the road towards Little Catalina after the dance. A search party was organized, and for 2 weeks, local men searched the forests and the bogs while fishing boats scanned the coastline, but never found any sign of this little girl. Eventually, everybody came to the grim conclusion that she must have gotten lost in the dark and fallen into a bog hole, which, like quicksand, will suck you down. Months later, one man claimed to have seen her floating over the bogs one evening. He said that he attempted to go out to her, but she disappeared into the forest. I suppose nobody put much weight behind his claims because he was a drunk. Years later, though, probably early 1920s, my great-grandmother said that she was out berry picking in the bog with her sister as the sun began to set. She said that she looked across the bog and saw a little girl floating steadily and smoothly over the ground. She said her movement was so smooth that there was no possible way that it could have been a real person walking. My great-grandmother claimed to have seen her a few more times throughout the years, and she since passed in 1991. In the summer of 2008, I was 16 years old. My grandfather and I were spending the summer in Little Catalina with relatives. Being old enough to drive, I spent most of my days in Catalina at the swimming hole. One evening, I was driving back with a distant cousin, and as we were passing the bogs, he pointed out the windshield and said, "What's that?" When I looked over, I saw a little girl standing in the bog. Except the strange thing was her height. She seemed overly tall for the distance that we were away from her. It was about 40 yards. I would have guessed that she would have been 7 feet tall, but her proportions didn't seem to match being that tall. I slowed down and I asked my cousin, who's a local, if he knew her. He said no. The girl then turned and smoothly and quickly floated away behind some trees. My cousin and I were genuinely freaked out and we drove back home. When I got home, I told my grandfather what I had seen, and all he said was, "Huh," and then told me the story about my great-grandmother telling him. He said over the years he had heard of people who had seen a ghost in the bogs, but always thought it was just a story to keep kids from playing out there since it was so dangerous.